Hi, everybody. I hope you all are well. I figured today I would talk about something I watched happen. A little bit of living history here, and why things, if you're feeling like things are really bad, um, you're not deluded. You're not wrong. And I really, really feel for Gen Z and Alpha. I really do. Um, so I wanted to talk about something that is not in the mainstream media, but it is on Social Security's website, and that is why Social Security is going away. So I looked this up, and you can look it up too. The source is online via Social Security's website, and it talks about why Social Security is going bye-bye. So during the Reagan administration, the boomers were working and the boomers were voting. And Boomer Congress authorized spending the entire Social Security trust, totaling $7.2 trillion. The government spent it all under the pretenses that, it'll be paid back by the time boomers retire. We can spend it, it's fine. And they did that selfishly. They didn't do the math. It wasn't thought out. How it escaped their mind, I don't know. But when you're greedy and you're focused on yourself, you're not going to do the math, are you? No. So what ended up happening is we don't know what that money was spent on, but we did have billion-dollar space shuttles. We did have the Cold War. We had a big chunk of mega spending. How we afforded those space shuttles? Yeah, to make ourselves look good, to innovate, to be the greatest nation on earth. Well, the boomers, Congress, blew not just their parents' retirement, and their parents are post-war and silent generation. Not only blew silent generation and post-war generations retirement, but half of their own as well. So that $7.2 trillion was built up over two generations to pay for two generations, 2.5 generations, because the boomers were already, they were having kids. I am the child of a 1948. So my father was post-war in 29. My mother was 48. So she's one of the oldest boomers. And they were working at that time. So my mother in the 80s during Reagan she didn't vote for Reagan because she saw through it, the trickle-down economics. She was bitching about it even when I was a little kid. But in any case, it ended up being that they blew that retirement. So the post-war and silent generations got to retire because the boomers' taxation was paying for it. So while the boomers were paying their taxes while working, that paid for their parents' retirement and their grandparents' retirement. So they got to retire. But hence boomer, the baby boom is the largest generation in history, of course, what they're famous for. And they did not do the math as for what happens when the largest generation in history retires. Yeah, so that $7.2 trillion was half of their retirement that they blew. So they were in their 30s at the time, their early 30s and 20s and stuff. So they were voting, and they voted against their children and blew half of their own retirement. So now I'm Gen X. So the older boomers gave birth to Gen X. The younger ones had the millennials. And so now the millennials and Gen X, their children are paying for their retirement, but don't get to retire because all of our taxes are going to pay for the retirement of the largest generation in history. And we can't do that and save. So all of our money that we've been paying our entire lives is paying for our parents' retirement. And then there's nothing left for us to retire because they blew 20 years of their retirement. So 20 years later, they're retiring on us and we get nothing. So Gen X is the first generation to be raised without parents and the first generation to not get back their Social Security taxes upon retirement. So Gen X has to pay for their own retirement. There is no Social Security for us. Yeah, and so by the time 2001 came around and Bush Jr. was president, right when the boomers were retiring, well, actually that was more the post-war was retiring, and the boomers were set to retire around the 2020s, right? 20 years later, the boomers were going to be retiring, but they already blew half of their retirements in the 80s, and so only 50% of their retirement was paid into, and that totaled 1.9 trillion. Only 1.9 trillion had built back up. And meanwhile, that has to go to the post-war generation's retirement, right? So now that the boomers retired in the 2020s, anyone born in the 70s and 60s, we don't get to retire. We're done. We're toast because that 1.9 trillion that had built back up, it wasn't enough. It was short. It wasn't enough to pay for the silent post-war and boomers to retire. 1.9 trillion isn't enough. But to add insult to injury, Bush's Congress authorized spending the 1.9 trillion that had built back up. So at least 1.9 trillion of their what needed to be at least 5 trillion, at least that was there, right? So that at least half of their retirement was there. And they blew it again. The Social Security Trust was blown again. So the bloomers then turned around and blew the half of their retirement that was left. And I stopped voting after this creepy thing happened with the Gore administration. And there was a huge, long dispute, and Gore finally conceded that, okay, fine, I won the popular vote, but whatever, I'll go to Congress. And I watched person after person say, nay, Mr. President. So Al Gore was addressed as Mr. President. And all he needed was one person to say yay, and he would have been president. I watched person after person with a somber face say, nay, Mr. President, nay, Mr. President, nay, Mr. President. Now, Gore's pitch was the Social Security lockbox. That was his biggest priority, was making sure that the government could not ever raid Social Security again. They could no longer borrow the people's money. And that was his top priority that he was pitching. And he won, but somehow unwon. And I have not voted since. I realized that obviously my vote doesn't count because I voted and I watched everybody basically say that my vote didn't count. He got the Nobel Peace Prize for conceding and just saying, fine, Bush is president, whatever. And the very first thing that Congress did after unelecting him was to spend that Social Security. So Gen X watched this go down. We watched it happen. We watched the boomers have it all and leave us with nothing. So the boomers voted for themselves, completely screwing over their children, which is millennial and Gen X. So yes, things are very bad because they enacted Reaganomics, trickle-down economics, that, don't tax the wealthy because they make the economy. They're the ones spending the most money, so let them spend it. Don't tax them because they'll be spending all that money, which is great for the economy. That was a lie. It was absolutely a lie. And anybody with half a brain could see through that lie. So trickle-down economics was a failure. It was to begin with. It was a giant lie just to get votes. And so when I was growing up, my mother told me about the new business model called getting rid of middle management. So in the 90s, a revolutionary boomer business model was set up in which corporate America decided to lay off a bunch of managers, leaving the half of the managers to do the job of their managers. So managers were forced into doing the workload of 2 people. Really smart. And that was to save. Meanwhile, they're not paying taxes like the previous generation. So not only did they get their taxes slashed to the point of there's a ton of loopholes they pull to not pay taxes at all, but then they cut their workforce. So after they got their tax breaks, they got greedy because wealth taxes used to keep greed in check. So runaway greed, they got even more greedy and sliced their workforces in half. And my mom's job went bye-bye as a result. So by decreasing the workforce, they're chronically understaffed. And so each person is now responsible for the workload of up 2 to 3 to 4 people now. It has gotten so out of hand. And so as a result, Gen X watched this happen. We got screwed over because we watched employers become worse and worse and worse. Next thing you know, there's a few HR officers trying to smooth things over and do whatever to shut up and fire employees and do some cutthroat things that were just ruthless and wrong. And they also, at the same time, did not increase wages. They have been stingy about wages. And I remember Boeing, one of the tactics they pull is, if you make us pay taxes, we will have to lay off a bunch of workers. Which is a lie. Because all I have to do is take a lower profit, right? But when the high-ups are not taxed to keep greed in check and balance things, they get more and more and more greedy. Greed, money is an addiction. It is the number one downfall of man, is greed. And they got bitten by that and have destroyed everything, essentially. And so Gen X is working our butts off. We're overworked. We're exhausted. We're the first generation that gets to have both parents working and not really get a whole lot of places. We were at least able to afford homes, though. I own my home. Most of us were able to own our homes, but not our children. Not our children. So Gen Z and Gen Alpha don't even get to own their homes. And the retiring boomers say, hey, you will own nothing and be happy. Why, quote, why own the American dream when you can just rent it? And you'll see my things on homeowner harassment. Like, these investors, these Wall Street investors beg for your home. If you do own a home, they don't stop. You get texts and phone calls from Wall Street trying to buy your home. It's not for sale. It's not listed for sale. You don't want to sell it. This is my forever home. And one thing the middle class does is pass their homes on to their children to create generational wealth, and that's what makes the middle class. And these investors are trying to steal the very last scraps that Gen X has, so that Gen Z and beyond get nothing, so that our children get nothing. So jobs, yes, they have gotten worse. And now that people are not spending as much money, places are closing down. They're warning that economy is crashing. But rather than taking a pay cut themselves, they are slashing more and more and more and more jobs, saying that, oh, it's because people aren't spending. When the fact of the matter is, ultimately, it's not the fact that we are wanting to cut spending. It is not the fact that, we obviously are buying the same amount of food. We're still buying the same amount of clothes and things like that. In fact, we're buying more because things are made like garbage intentionally. That was the other thing that started happening thanks to WTO. I'll go into that in another video that Gen X watched happen. But yeah, it's that our money is going nowhere. We don't get to save. Because boomers have decided to enhance their retirement by becoming landlords, and Wall Street and such is gobbling up homes. I'll go into that in another video too, at lightning speed, to benefit themselves. And they don't want anybody to own anymore. They think it's best for everybody to rent their cars or lease them. Everybody to lease their transportation and housing from them. Ownership is power, you guys. Ownership is power. Ownership is freedom. That is why it was called the American Dream. And it is dead. They killed it. So as a Gen X, I want Gen Z and Alpha to understand that we empathize with you. We don't think you're lazy. That's the boomers. We don't think, oh, you just don't want to work. We know. We watched the job market crash out and suck. We watched it happen, and we saw why. So, okay, we completely empathize, and we are extremely mad at what they're doing to you. So this is a message to the younger generations. This is what happened, and it's extremely sad, and we're mad. So don't think that Gen X is out there saying, get your stuff together, you just blah, 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 blah. No. You're not lazy, you're not dumb, or anything of the sort. It's because Wall Street has decided that they know what you can afford and that everybody can afford what they can afford. And so, therefore, everybody can afford a New York apartment for $7,000 a month. No. They can afford that, but nobody else can. And so now they have decided that the middle class begins at $100,000 when originally the middle class began at $30,000. Back in boomer generation, if you made $30,000 a year, you were set. Now, you're not set until you hit 100. Look at that markup, you guys. Does that make any sense? No. But when Wall Street and the elites are allowed to run the country rather than the people, this is what happens. We're not going to make it. Something is coming. But it's not you. It's not you. Thanks.